Hi there and welcome once again. This is Jennifer McGuire and I have another technique video for you. In today's video, I'm going to do an embossed impression technique. This is a great way to get new looks out of your dies. Instead of die cutting, you're making impressions and actually stamping with your dies. I've done many variations on this technique in past videos, and I will link to those below if you want to check them out. However, when I was recently doing this technique, I came up with a tip that is really helpful in getting quick, good results, so I thought I'd do another video and share that with you. Okay, for this technique, you'll need watercolor paper. I find that watercolor paper works best when making an impression with a die, but if you have letterpress paper, that would work too. I also am going to be using the Simon Says Stamp Stitched Oak Leaf die for my first example. This is a perfect die for this, but as you'll see, many different dies would work. You'll also need a die cut machine. For today's example, I'm using my Spellbinders Platinum 6, but you could use any die cut machine you may have for this. You'll also need an embossing mat. I really like the Spellbinders Embossing Mat, and I use this with all the other die cut machines too. This embossing mat is an inexpensive tool that I recommend for anyone who has a die cut machine. All machines come with an instruction manual telling you what sandwich to use. In this case, the Spellbinders Platinum has this platform, and on it are the instructions on how to use an embossing mat with the die to make an impression. On other machines, I often use whatever sandwich is recommended when using an embossing folder. That seems to work well when using an embossing mat with the die also. But again, I've done this with all different types of machines, and it is possible and a great way to get more out of your dies. So I put my embossing mat down, and now I'm putting my watercolor paper down with the smooth side facing up. I'm then using an anti-static powder tool, which I think is very helpful with this technique. Okay, now it's time to ink up our die. I'm first going to use my anti-static powder tool just to make sure there's nothing on it already. And then I'm going to lightly tap the cutting edge with my VersaMark ink pad. We're barely touching it, just touching the cutting edge only. You don't want to get ink into the valleys of the die. Now I'm picking up the die and placing it down onto my paper, making sure I don't shift it around because I want to keep that ink just on the cutting edge. Okay, so I'm putting my embossing plate on top because that's what the Spellbinders Platinum 6 instructs you to do, and run it back and forth through my machine. This will allow the die to press into the paper, leaving an impression. But remember, since we put ink on the raised surface, it also puts ink into the impression. Now I'm adding Hero Art's gold embossing powder, and the powder goes into those little crevices. But unfortunately, as you see here, I'm going to freeze it. You can see there's lots of powder on the inside. It's kind of messy there in the middle. That's because I probably got ink inside of the die. Well, here's the trick that I found is so easy. You just take another piece of paper and scrape across it. And look, it knocks off all the embossing powder that's sitting on the surface of the paper and only leaves the embossing powder in the impressed areas, in those little crevices. And that's the look that we're going for. Now I found a few spots where there was powder where I didn't want it, so I just brushed it away with a dry brush. And now I'm going to heat set the powder that's in the impression. It takes a little bit longer since the powder's set back in there, but check this out. You get this fine line of embossing, and it's in the impression of the paper. It's such a cool look. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add a sentiment to this one before we move on to another example. I'm using the Simon Says Stamp All the Thanks stamp set, which is one I use a lot in videos. I thought the style of this thank you was perfect because it's a very thin, clean line sentiment, and it seemed to match nicely with the thin embossing that we did with this technique. Now before we go on to adding color to this, I wanted to do a few more embossed impressions with different dies so you can see that it works with many different styles and sizes. Here I'm using a bigger die. This is a maple leaf die from Simon Says Stamp. And I have my sentiment there so I could kind of plan out where the die needed to go. I'm positioning it so that the die kind of hangs off the edge of the paper. Once again, I'm lightly tapping the cutting edge of the die with VersaMark ink. Then I'm going to carefully place it on my paper without moving it around, and then run it through my machine with the embossing mat. The embossing mat has give to it, which allows you to make an impression instead of cutting with the die. I also wanted to mention, before I forget, that this technique works great with background dies. I didn't show any examples in this particular video. I kind of wanted some simple, clean designs, but you definitely can use intricate background dies for this embossed impression technique. Okay, so after adding my gold embossing powder, there's a lot in the middle that I don't want there. So I'm just lightly rubbing the cardstock, like the edge of a piece of scrap cardstock, over the surface, and that knocks away the excess powder. I then can go ahead and heat set all the powder that's in the impression. I like to heat from the back too, just so I can make sure it's all melted in there. Okay, so I went ahead and gold heat embossed the word blessings also, which is from the same Simon Says stamp, All the Thanks stamp set. Okay, let's do another example before we add some color to these. This is the Simon Says stamp Ornamental Wreath die, and I was really excited to see that it worked great with this technique also. I'm starting with my watercolor paper, smooth side up, use my anti-static powder tool, added ink to the cutting edge of that wreath die, making sure I didn't press too firmly, put it on my paper and ran it through, added my gold embossing powder, scraped away any of the excess, and you can see it works perfect with this. And then I added heat to melt all that powder. So you can see even detailed dies like this one work great with this technique. Okay, for a sentiment, I use the CZ Design Clean Line Everyday stamp set. This is also from Simon Says stamp, and it has some more of those thin line sentiments. I took the Miss You and I cut it in half so that I could have the words stacked on top of each other instead of next to each other, and that allowed it to fit perfectly inside of my wreath. I stamped that with VersaMark ink, added the gold embossing powder, and there we have a perfect sentiment for right inside, and it all is that beautiful gold embossing. Okay, I have one more embossed impression to do before we add the color. This last example is a snowflake die from Simon Says stamp, and I wanted to show you that snowflake dies work great for this. So I'm following all the same steps as before. However, this time I instead decided to use silver embossing powder. Any ultra fine or just regular embossing powder would work. I don't recommend one with glitter because it doesn't get into the nooks and crannies very well and give a crisp image. So I would just stick with basic embossing powders or ultra fine. Okay, so now I have all of these impressions done. Now it's time to add some color to these. And there are many different ways to do this. I decided to do watercolor with my Holtz Distress Inks, but you could use regular watercolor, you could use colored pencils, you could use markers, any coloring medium that you prefer. All I'm going to do is add color inside of our embossed impression. If you wanted to, you could leave it as is and have a very clean and simple card, but I like the look of watercolor in these really crisp, clean lines. So I pressed down onto my glass mat, that's the work surface I'm working on. I pressed a Wild Honey, Rusty Hinge, Barn Door, and Vintage Photo Distress Inks. I then squirted a little water into each of the colors, and I'm just picking it up with my brush and painting it into this leaf, trying my best to stay inside of the lines. If you go outside of the line, that's okay. You can just use a little eraser to erase that color from the edge, or just scrape it away with a craft knife. Okay, after I painted that leaf, I went ahead and set it aside to dry, and we'll move on to this next one. You can see I'm not taking great care to get a perfect image. I wanted to create some quick cards, and this works perfectly. This time I'm using peeled paint, mowed lawn, and crushed olive distress inks. And I went through first and put down some color, and I had a lighter amount of color, and I wish I would have left it at that. I feel like the lighter color works better because you can still see the detail of the embossed impression. But I ended up going and adding a lot more color to it to give a darker look. Both work, but I would recommend going a bit softer if you try this. I just feel like it shows off the technique better. I do recommend setting it aside to dry. I started to heat set it here, but you don't want to mess up the embossing powder, so I decided to quit the heat setting and just set it aside. Okay, for the coloring on this one, it would have been easier to use markers or colored pencils to get into those little areas, but I again decided to use my distress inks and water for a watercolor look. I used Mowed Lawn, Twisted Citron, and Festive Berry. Okay, now that all of these are colored and dried, let's go ahead and create some cards, and I have some ideas to share. For this first card, I decided to add faux stitching around the outside edge using the Lawn Fawn Just Stitching double rectangle dies, which I use a lot in my videos. These dies just create 2 lines of faux stitching. It doesn't actually cut. So I did it on the front of a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch note card, added my watercolor piece in the center, and then added glossy accents to the berries alone just to give it a little bit of shine. Here's a closer look at the embossed impression with the watercolor on the inside. You can see the shine on the berries from the glossy accents and the faux stitching around the edge. Very simple design, but I feel like when you have a cool technique like this, you should let it shine by keeping the card simple. Okay, now let's move on to this card example. Notice that I have some gold splatter on this one. Now, some people like the splatter look, some people don't. I totally get it. I have control issues, so I have to kind of control the splatter a bit. You could totally skip this step if you wanted to. But I wanted to show you a fun option for getting that gold splatter look with a bit of control. I first used my anti-static powder tool on that panel. And now I have a brush that has nothing but water on it. And I'm tapping the brush to cause little drops of water to go onto my card. I then add gold embossing powder, and those water droplets hold the gold embossing powder. Now here's the cool part. You can use a dry brush to wipe away any of that water and embossing powder that you don't want. So I removed a lot of those little splatters, and I cleaned up the area around my sentiment so it didn't overlap. And then I heat set it, and what happens is the water evaporates, but the embossing powder stays behind. So believe it or not, you can emboss with water. And I really like that because I can control where the splatter goes and give it kind of a messy but clean look. I did also use that faux stitching die around the outside of the note card, and there's a closer look at the embossed impression and the gold embossing. Okay, let's do some more of that gold splatter on this next example here. I use my anti-static powder tool. I have a wet brush that I'm just tapping to cause little droplets to land on my card. Now I'm adding my gold embossing powder, and you'll see I have a lot of tiny little specks this time because I didn't have much water on my brush. That's okay, I can brush away any of the excess before I heat emboss it. Add the heat to it, and there we have that gold splatter. I always like to clean up the area around the sentiment so it doesn't overlap. So here's a closer look at the final result. I did trim my white panel down and added it to a green 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch note card. And then I added 2 gold cardstock strips above and below the white panel. Very simple card design and a fun technique. Now here is the Snowflake example. Off screen, I did paint that with Tumbled Glass Distress Ink, Mermaid Lagoon, and Blueprint Sketch. Now I'm tapping on some water splatter and adding silver embossing powder this time. Any of it that overlaps the snowflake too much and gives too much of a messy look, I brush away with my dry brush. And then once I'm happy with the splatter that I have, I'll go ahead and heat set it with my heat gun. It does take a little bit longer to melt the powder when there's water behind it because you have to evaporate the water, but it works perfect. I trimmed that down and added that to a silver metallic cardstock from Gina K Designs. And then I stamped a simple sentiment and added it right to the center with a thin strip of foam tape. Again, this is a very simple card design, but I feel like it has a lot of interest thanks to the texture and the shine of this embossed impression technique. By the way, the piece to you this season is from the CZ Designs Clean Line Christmas Stamp Set. Okay, there you have one of my favorite techniques and a great way to get a new look from your dies without doing any die cutting. If you are interested in the different products that I featured today, they are linked in my YouTube description, along with some other videos you might like. In the middle are 2 other videos. One of them uses some of the same products as I did today, and another uses a similar technique. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again soon, and have a wonderful week.